The cold wind cut through the night, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. As Alex approached the abandoned barn, his breath became shallow, the air growing heavier with each step. The structure loomed in the distance, a skeletal figure against the pale moonlight, its wooden beams twisted and cracked, as if groaning under the weight of the secrets it held. He hesitated at the gate, a creeping sense of dread clawing at his chest. Something about this place felt alive, watching him, waiting. The barn's door, hanging loosely on rusted hinges, swayed ever so slightly, though there was no breeze strong enough to move it. And then, faintly, he heard it, a whisper, barely audible, like a breath against the skin. It called his name. The sound was soft, yet unmistakable, echoing through the silence of the night, sending chills down his spine. He paused, his mind racing. Could it have been the wind? Or was there someone inside? The ground beneath his boots felt softer as he moved closer, the thick grass giving way to mud, like the earth itself was trying to swallow him whole. His eyes scanned the area, but everything appeared still, too still. No insects chirped, no owls hooted, as if the world had fallen into an unnatural silence. The barn seemed to pulse, an almost imperceptible hum vibrating through the air. Shadows played tricks on his vision, darting at the corners of his eyes only to vanish when he turned his head. He reached for the handle of the door, but as his fingers brushed the rough wood, it swung open with a creak, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like a distant conversation he wasn't supposed to overhear. With a deep breath, Alex stepped inside. The air within the barn was colder, stale, filled with the scent of rot and something else, something metallic. He felt his skin prickle, as if the very walls were pressing in on him, closing the space between him and whatever lurked in the shadows. The beams above his head groaned again, but this time it wasn't the wind. It felt deliberate, like the barn itself was responding to his presence. He fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark, but the light seemed muted, as though the darkness swallowed a whole. The faint outline of tools hung on the walls, their rusted edges glinting dully, and hay scattered across the floor crunched under his feet. But then, there it was again, a whisper, this time clearer, closer. His name, spoken softly but with an undeniable urgency. Panic clawed at his throat, and he turned to leave, but something stopped him in his tracks. A faint outline at the far end of the barn caught his eye. Something or someone standing just beyond the reach of the light. It was still, almost blending into the shadows, but Alex could feel its gaze on him, cold and unblinking. His heart raced, pounding against his chest as he slowly backed away, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The whisper returned, now clearer than ever, and though it was a voice he didn't recognize, there was something deeply familiar about it. Come closer, it seemed to urge, though his instincts screamed at him to run. But Alex couldn't move, frozen by an invisible force, his feet rooted to the ground as the figure in the shadows began to shift, its shape slowly emerging from the dark. As Alex stood frozen in the barn, the figure in the shadows remained motionless, but his mind suddenly pulled him somewhere else, back to a distant, nearly forgotten memory. It was the same barn, but years ago, when he was just a child. He could see himself and his older brother, laughing as they played near the edge of the field, their carefree voices echoing across the farm. His brother had always been fearless, daring Alex to explore places he was too scared to enter. It was his brother's idea to come to the barn that day, and though Alex was reluctant, he followed. They played hide and seek in the long-forgotten hay bales, their laughter filling the empty space. But then something changed. He could still hear the distant memory of his brother's laughter, but it suddenly stopped. The silence was suffocating. Alex remembered searching frantically, calling his brother's name, but he was gone, vanished without a trace. No one believed him when he said he heard whispers that day. No one believed the barn had taken him. Back in the present, Alex felt a cold sweat run down his spine. His hands trembled as the weight of that memory settled heavily, in his chest. He hadn't thought about his brother in years, had tried to forget the trauma of that day. But now, standing in this same barn, it was as if the past had come crashing back, demanding to be acknowledged. His heart pounded in his ears as he stepped forward, his flashlight beam wavering across the floor, until something caught his eye. Something small, half buried in the dirt and hay. He knelt down, his fingers shaking as they brushed away the debris. His breath hitched. There, lying beneath the dirt, was a small wooden toy car, his brother's favorite. The toy was weathered, aged by time, but unmistakable. Alex's hand shook as he picked it up, the wood cold and damp in his palm. He hadn't seen it in years, not since the day his brother disappeared. The toy should have been long gone, buried in the past along with the memory of that tragic day. But here it was, as if it had been waiting for him. His mind raced with questions, but one thought echoed louder than the rest. Why was it here? His grip tightened around the toy, his pulse quickening as the whispers returned, louder now, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his temple, and the world around him seemed to warp. His vision blurred, and the barn's familiar walls began to bend and stretch, twisting into a distorted version of the place he once knew. In the haze, Alex saw flashes of his brother, his face, his voice, flickering in and out of his mind like a broken film reel. But these weren't the happy memories he cherished. No, these were darker, twisted. His brother's once kind eyes were now hollow, his voice a distant echo of pain and fear. And then, a voice, low and raspy, cut through the noise in his mind. You left him behind. Alex staggered, clutching his head as the barn seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing tighter, suffocating him with the weight of the past. His mind swirled with confusion and guilt. Had he really left his brother behind? The day his brother disappeared, Alex had run for help, but no one ever found any trace of him. The authorities chalked it up to an accident, or perhaps the boy wandering too far into the woods. But deep down, Alex had always known there was more to the story. Something darker, something he couldn't explain. And now, standing in the heart of this cursed place, he was beginning to realize the truth was far worse than he had ever imagined. The toy car in his hand grew impossibly cold, almost burning his skin, and as he dropped it, it landed with a dull thud. In that moment, a new memory surfaced, one that had been buried deep, too painful to recall until now. It wasn't just his brother who had vanished. Alex had seen him, just for a brief moment, before the barn swallowed him whole. A dark figure had emerged from the shadows, its long, skeletal fingers reaching out and dragging his brother into the darkness. Alex had been too terrified to move, too afraid to save him. And now, years later, it was back. The barn was back, and it wanted him. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the barn, though all the doors were closed. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now, and Alex's heart raced in his chest. The toy car began to roll on its own, spinning slowly in a circle before stopping at his feet. The message was clear. The barn had unfinished business, and it wasn't going to let him leave until he faced the truth. Alex's mind was spiraling as the barn seemed to shift and breathe around him, the oppressive atmosphere squeezing his chest tighter with every passing second. His brother's presence, or at least the echo of it, lingered in the air like a heavy fog. The whispers, once subtle and distant, now screamed at him from all sides, urging him to make a decision. He wasn't alone anymore. In the dark corner of the barn, the figure he had seen earlier began to move, slow, deliberate steps that sent a cold shiver down Alex's spine. Its form was indistinct, cloaked in shadows that seemed to swirl around it like smoke, but the malevolent energy it radiated was undeniable. This was no mere ghost. This was something far older, far darker, and it had waited years for this moment. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into a single, guttural voice, deep and dripping with malice. To bring him back, it growled, "You must give me something in return." The figure stopped a few feet from Alex, close enough for him to feel its icy breath on his skin, though he could see no face. "A piece of you," it continued. "For a piece of him. Your most precious memory. Of him. Of anything. It is the only way." The words hung in the air, like a noose around Alex's neck. He realized, with a sickening dread, that the creature was offering him a terrible bargain. His brother could be freed from whatever hellish existence he had been trapped in, but at a cost. Alex would have to surrender his most cherished memory, the last vestige of a life he had once known, or leave his brother to rot forever in the clutches of this malevolent force. The thought of never seeing his brother again, never knowing what had really happened, was unbearable. But equally horrifying was the idea of losing the only memory that had kept him going all these years, the image of his brother smiling, carefree, before everything went wrong. If he gave that up, would he even recognize his brother when he saw him again? Would he lose himself in the process? The figure seemed to sense his hesitation, its form flickering with impatience. "Choose," it hissed, its voice reverberating through the barn, shaking the very beams that held the place together. Terror surged through Alex, paralyzing him for a moment. The barn seemed to close in tighter, its walls groaning under the weight of the dark presence that filled the space. Time was running out. His mind raced, frantically playing out the consequences of each option. If he gave the creature his memory, he might lose not only the recollection of his brother, but also the connection to his own humanity. The memory was more than just an image in his mind. It was his last anchor to a time before the nightmares, before the loss. Without it, who would he be? Would he even care about saving his brother, or would the darkness consume them both? But if he refused, he would be leaving his brother behind, abandoning him to the same fate that had haunted Alex since that fateful day. The guilt would be unbearable, a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. Worse still, the entity might decide to keep them both, trapping Alex in this purgatory of rotting wood and whispered curses, forever locked in the barn's dark embrace. He couldn't win. Either choice led to suffering. There was no escape. The figure loomed closer, its shadow stretching across the floor, and Alex felt his heart pounding in his chest, cold sweat dripping down his neck. His hands trembled as he held the toy car, the last physical link to his brother. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him, suffocating him with their demands. They twisted his thoughts, distorting reality until he could no longer tell if the voice in his head was his own or the creature's. "You have to choose," it hissed again, its tone now sharp and cruel. "Sacrifice your most precious memory, or live with the knowledge that you let him die." Alex's eyes darted around the barn, looking for a way out, but there was none. The darkness swallowed every exit, trapping him in this nightmare. He had no choice but to make the impossible decision. His throat felt tight, his pulse racing as he clutched the memory in his mind, the one moment of pure happiness he still held on to. It was his brother's laugh, that carefree sound that echoed through their childhood, a memory untainted by the horrors that followed. The thought of losing it felt like tearing out a piece of his soul. But if he didn't, his brother's fate would be sealed forever. The figure waited, its presence pressing against Alex like a vice, and finally he whispered, "I choose the memory." The words barely left his lips before the air in the barn grew impossibly cold. The figure moved faster now, with a sickening glee, and Alex felt a sharp, agonizing pull in his mind, like something was being ripped away from him. His vision blurred, his knees buckling as he collapsed to the floor, the toy car slipping from his hand. He gasped for breath, his head spinning, as he felt the last thread of that precious memory fade into nothingness, leaving behind only an empty void where it once was. The barn seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting just slightly. The figure retreated into the shadows, its form dissolving, but not before leaving Alex with one final, chilling whisper, "It's done." The whispers fell silent, and the barn was once again still. But as Alex lay there, trembling and broken, he realized with a deep, gnawing fear that he couldn't remember his brother's face anymore. The memory was gone, and with it, a part of himself. As Alex struggled to stand, his legs weak and trembling, The barn seemed to shift once again, its oppressive darkness growing heavier, more tangible. The whispers, once silenced by his terrible choice, began to creep back, but now they were different. Before, they had called his name softly, like distant voices barely breaking through the silence. Now they felt closer, more insidious, as if they weren't just around him, but within him. Every shadow in the barn seemed to hold something alive, something watching, waiting. The air itself felt thicker, almost as if it were breathing, and every intake of breath made the walls groan, as though the structure was reacting to his presence. The beam of his flashlight flickered and dimmed, barely cutting through the murky atmosphere. Objects within the barn, once familiar and mundane, tools, ropes, scattered debris, now seemed distorted, their edges sharp, their forms warped in unnatural ways. The hay on the ground rustled, but there was no breeze. Every small movement in the dark was amplified, echoing in Alex's mind like a distant heartbeat, quickening with each second. His pulse matched the rhythm, and his fear spiked as he realized the barn was no longer just a place. It was alive. He turned in place, scanning the barn, and for a brief moment, he swore he saw something just beyond the edge of his vision. A shadow that darted across the wall, too fast to be real, too vague to be human. His heart raced, and his instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground, like the barn had its claws in him, refusing to let go. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, forming half-words that twisted and curled in his ears. "Stay," they murmured. "Don't leave." Panic surged through him. He knew something was terribly wrong, that the barn was playing tricks on him, manipulating his senses. But then, the whispers took on a familiar tone, a voice he hadn't heard in years. It was his brother, Alex. The voice called, low and pained, as though coming from deep within the walls. The sound of his name, spoken by a voice so achingly familiar, made his blood run cold. He spun toward the source, but all he saw was the yawning darkness of the barn. His flashlight flickered again, sputtering like a dying flame. And that's when he noticed something horrifying. The shadows on the walls weren't just shadows. They moved on their own, writhing and twisting in unnatural shapes. They were reaching for him. The darkness seemed to stretch, like a living thing, crawling across the floor, slow but relentless, like it was pulling itself toward him. He backed away, but the floor beneath him felt soft, unstable, as if it were ready to give way at any moment. Suddenly, the creaking of the old wooden beams overhead grew louder, the noise sharp and piercing in the silent barn. It was as if something heavy had settled on the roof, something massive. Alex looked up, but there was nothing there, only the darkened rafters. Still, he felt its presence, felt the weight of whatever it was pressing down on the barn, bending the space around him. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. The walls began to shift, twisting at odd angles. They seemed to move of their own accord, stretching, warping, as if the barn itself was alive, a grotesque organism feeding off his fear. The space around him expanded and contracted like the slow inhale and exhale of some monstrous creature. The whispers, now louder and more insistent, surrounded him on all sides. They were no longer just calling his name. They were beckoning him to come closer, to step into the shadows where something waited, hidden and hungry. Out of the corner of his eye, Alex saw it again, a figure, barely visible in the shifting gloom, standing near the far end of the barn. Its shape was humanoid, but wrong. It was too tall, too thin, and its limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally, like shadows cast by a dying light. It stood still, watching him, though Alex couldn't see its eyes. But he felt them, cold, unblinking, boring into him. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the whispers around him intensified, as if feeding off its presence. He felt a pressure building in his chest, the air too thick to breathe. His vision blurred at the edges, and every instinct screamed at him to flee. But something was holding him there, keeping him tethered to the spot. His brother's voice echoed again, this time closer, more desperate. "Alex, help me." The voice was weak, strained, as though it came from a place beyond this world. It was impossible, but the pull was undeniable. Alex's heart ached. Could it really be his brother? Was he trapped somewhere within this place, calling out for help after all these years? Just as quickly as the thought crossed his mind, something brushed against his arm, soft cold, like the touch of a hand. He jerked back, his flashlight clattering to the ground, plunging him into near darkness. The beam rolled across the floor, its light catching something in the far corner, a fleeting glimpse of movement. Something crouched there, low to the ground, its long fingers scratching against the wooden floorboards. It was waiting for him. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping now, rising to a fever pitch. They twisted around him, pulling at his sanity, making him question what was real. The barn was alive with voices, none of them his own. His head pounded, his thoughts clouded with fear and confusion. He needed to get out, but every time he tried to move, the shadows seemed to pull him back, wrapping around his legs like tendrils, dragging him closer to the thing waiting in the dark. And then, in one final, chilling moment, the whispers stopped. The barn fell deathly silent, as if the very air had been sucked from the room. Alex stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. In the oppressive quiet, he heard it again, a single, soft whisper, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to freeze the blood in his veins. It wasn't his brother's voice this time. It was something far older, far darker. "You're already mine." Alex's mind was unraveling. The darkness of the barn pressed in on him from all sides, thick and suffocating, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. He could feel it now, the weight of the fear that had been creeping into his bones since he first stepped inside. The fear wasn't just something he felt. It was alive, wrapping around his thoughts, twisting them, warping everything he knew. It whispered in his ears, taunting him, pulling him deeper into the dark abyss of his mind. Every shadow, every movement in the barn was a reflection of his deepest terrors. Suddenly, visions began to flood his mind, horrific, vivid images that gripped his heart with cold, sharp claws. He saw his brother, but not as he remembered him. In the vision, his brother was gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and hollow, his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin that twisted his once innocent face into a grotesque mask of pain. His skin was mottled, decayed, as though he had been trapped somewhere beyond death, rotting away in the darkness. The image flickered and shifted, and now Alex saw himself, staring into a mirror. Only the reflection was distorted. His face, like his brother's, began to warp, his skin pulling back, revealing the bones underneath. His eyes darkened until they were just empty pits, endless and black, like the void that had swallowed his brother. He reached out to touch the mirror in his mind, but the reflection reached back, its cold fingers brushing his skin. Alex recoiled, the terror tightening around him like a noose. The barn seemed to breathe with his fear, each inhale deepening the dread that coursed through him. Every creak of the wooden beams, every whisper of the wind, felt amplified, like the barn was alive and feeding off his terror. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as the darkness around him began to move, swirling in thick tendrils that danced at the edges of his vision. His mind was fraying, unraveling under the weight of the terror that had taken root inside him. His thoughts were no longer his own, consumed by the malevolent force that seemed to live in the very walls of the barn. Then, out of the blackness, something moved. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, its body twisting and bending in ways that defied nature, emerged from the shadows. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blank slate of darkness, its skin a smooth, featureless void. Yet somehow, Alex knew it was looking at him, studying him, savoring his fear. Its presence was suffocating, a weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, like the ground beneath him had turned to quicksand, pulling him deeper into the dark. The figure didn't speak, but its intentions were clear. It wanted him, his fear, his soul. Suddenly, the barn around him began to change, the walls twisting and warping like the nightmare in his mind. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, the wooden planks cracking and splintering. The walls closed in, and for a moment, Alex felt as if he were trapped inside a coffin, the air thick with the stench of decay. He could hear his own heartbeat, rapid and desperate, pounding in his ears. His skin crawled as the figure drew closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it were toying with him, savoring every second of his terror. And then, the whispers returned, but this time they weren't just sounds. They were thoughts, his thoughts, but twisted, distorted by the fear that now consumed him. They told him to give in, to let go, to embrace the terror. "There's no escape," they whispered. "The fear is all you have left." His mind spun with the weight of those words, the idea of surrendering to the darkness, so tempting, so easy. The fear had already taken hold of him, and fighting it seemed impossible. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to run, to escape, but his body refused to move. The barn was no longer just a structure. It had become a manifestation of his fear, a prison that shifted and twisted to trap him. The walls closed in tighter, the ceiling seemed to lower, and the air grew heavier, pressing against his lungs like an invisible hand squeezing the life out of him. His vision blurred as the figure grew closer, its presence so overwhelming that it was hard to think, hard to breathe. The whispers in his mind became louder, more insistent, telling him to give up, to let the fear take him. But then, amidst the chaos in his mind, a single thought broke through, a memory, fleeting but clear. It was of his brother, not as the twisted vision the barn had shown him, but as he really was. His brother's laugh, full of life and joy, echoed faintly in Alex's mind, cutting through the oppressive darkness. It was the only thing keeping him grounded, the only piece of himself that hadn't been consumed by the barn's malevolent grip. He held on to it, clung to it like a lifeline, as the fear tried to swallow him whole. The figure stopped, standing just inches from Alex now, its featureless face hovering above him, its cold presence like a void sucking the life from him. The whispers grew deafening, filling his head with screams and visions of horror. But Alex refused to give in. He closed his eyes, focusing on the memory of his brother's laughter, letting it drown out the noise, the fear, the darkness. He could feel the figure's icy breath on his skin, but he didn't move. He wouldn't let it take him. And then, in a moment of clarity, he realized something. The barn, the whispers, the figure. It was all feeding on his fear, growing stronger the more terrified he became. It was a parasite, thriving on his terror, and the only way to defeat it was to let go of that fear. Alex took a deep breath, steadying himself, and as he opened his eyes, he faced the figure head-on. It loomed over him, its presence suffocating, but this time, he didn't flinch. As Alex locked eyes with the featureless void before him, the barn seemed to hold its breath. The darkness around him swirled with an unnatural energy, as if the very walls were waiting for his next move. The air was thick, suffocating, but something inside him had shifted. The fear that had once gripped him, choking every rational thought, began to loosen its hold. He could feel the figure looming over him, its cold, oppressive presence filling the space, but now there was a flicker of defiance in his chest. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was ready to fight back. But just as he steeled himself, the barn came alive with a new wave of terror. The shadows on the walls began to writhe, twisting into grotesque shapes that reached out toward him with skeletal hands. The whispering returned, but this time it was louder, sharper, more frantic. "You can't escape," the voices hissed, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of madness. "You're ours now." The figure in front of him seemed to grow taller, its form stretching into the rafters, its limbs elongating like a monstrous spider preparing to strike. The shadows swirled around it, feeding off the fear still lingering in the pit of Alex's stomach. And then, The truth hit him with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. This wasn't just about the barn. The entity that stood before him wasn't some random ghost or lost spirit. No, this was personal. It had always been personal. The figure, this thing, was connected to him, to his past, to the terrible event that had shattered his childhood. His brother's disappearance all those years ago wasn't a tragic accident. The barn had taken him, and this entity was the one responsible. It had been waiting, feeding on his family's grief, growing stronger in the shadows, biding its time until Alex returned. A cold, sickening realization spread through him. This was no ordinary haunting. It was a predator, and it had been hunting him his whole life. Suddenly, his mind was flooded with memories, ones he had long buried, too painful to confront. He remembered the day his brother disappeared, the laughter, the game, and then the silence. But there was more. He had seen something that day, a figure in the corner of the barn, watching, waiting. He had felt its presence, cold and menacing, but he had been too young, too scared to understand what it was. He had run, leaving his brother behind. Now, all these years later, it had come for him, demanding a reckoning. The figure's whisper turned into a low, guttural growl, vibrating through the floorboards beneath his feet. "You failed him," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "You left him to die." The words cut deep, and Alex felt a surge of guilt rise in his chest. Was it true? Had his fear condemned his brother to this fate? The thought gnawed at him, and for a moment he faltered, the fear threatening to consume him once again. But then, through the haze of terror, Alex remembered the one thing the entity didn't anticipate. The connection between him and his brother wasn't just built on fear or guilt. It was built on love. The memory of his brother, the sound of his laughter, the bond they shared. It was stronger than any darkness this place could conjure. Alex realized that the entity had been feeding on his guilt for years, twisting it, amplifying it, but it couldn't touch the love he had for his brother. That was untouchable, incorruptible. The barn began to tremble as Alex stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the weight of the entity's presence bearing down on him, but he didn't look away. "You didn't take him," Alex said, his voice steady despite the fear still coursing through his veins. "He's not yours." The entity hissed, recoiling slightly as if it had been struck. The shadows around it writhed in agitation, the barn creaking and groaning as if the entire structure was about to collapse. But Alex could see now the entity's weakness. It had no real power over him, not if he refused to let the fear control him. The more he fought it, the weaker it became. Suddenly, the figure lunged, its long, twisted arms reaching for him, its featureless face contorting into a grotesque mask of rage. But Alex didn't move. He stood firm, his heart pounding in his chest, as the entity's dark tendrils of shadow wrapped around him. It was cold, suffocating, but he refused to give in. He could feel the darkness trying to seep into his mind, trying to make him relive that day, to break him with guilt and terror. But instead, Alex focused on his brother's face, on the love they shared, and with that, the fear began to fade. The entity screamed in fury, its voice a deafening roar that shook the very foundation of the barn. The shadows twisted violently, lashing out like wild beasts, but they couldn't touch him. Alex's resolve held strong, and for the first time, he felt the power shifting. The barn was no longer in control. He was. As the entity's form began to crumble, its once towering presence shrinking into the shadows from which it came, Alex took a deep breath, his fear finally loosening its grip on his heart. The whispers turned into faint, desperate murmurs, and then silence. The barn grew still, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifting, leaving behind only the quiet creak of wood and the faint rustle of wind through the cracks. The figure, now a mere shadow of what it had been, lingered in front of him, its form flickering and unstable. It was weakening, its power fading. Alex stepped forward, the last remnants of fear melting away as he looked into the void where its eyes should have been. "You don't own me," he whispered. And with that, the entity let out one final, anguished scream before dissolving into the shadows, its presence vanishing as if it had never existed. The barn was quiet once more, but Alex knew the battle wasn't over. There was still one final truth to uncover, and he wasn't leaving until he found it. The barn was eerily silent, the oppressive darkness having lifted, but the air remained thick with an unsettling tension. Alex stood in the center, his breathing still ragged from the encounter with the entity, but his resolve stronger than ever. He had driven the creature back, but something lingered, a presence that hadn't entirely dissipated. The barn itself still felt wrong, alive, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. Alex knew this wasn't over. The entity had been weakened, but it hadn't been destroyed. It was still here, hiding in the shadows, and he had to face it one last time. As he took a step forward, the floor beneath him creaked ominously. The barn seemed to groan in response, the wooden beams above shifting like tired bones. The temperature dropped again, the cold seeping into his skin, making his breath visible in the air. His eyes scanned the dark corners of the barn, looking for any sign of movement. He could feel it. Something watching him from the depths. Something far worse than the entity he had just fought. It was as though the barn itself was the true source of evil, and the creature he had encountered was merely a puppet, a servant to a darker, more ancient force. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him began to tremble. A deep, resonant sound echoed from the depths of the earth, and the barn's walls seemed to vibrate with a low, ominous hum. Alex stumbled, catching himself on a nearby post, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel it now, the malevolent presence rising from beneath, from the very foundation of the barn. The entity had been just the beginning. This was the true power that had been waiting, feeding on his fear, biding its time until he was weak enough to strike. The floorboards splintered and cracked, and from the gaping cracks in the wood, a thick, black smoke began to seep out, curling around his ankles like tendrils of living darkness. The smoke was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt, and it clung to him, making his skin crawl. He backed away, but the darkness followed, snaking across the floor toward him, faster, more determined. The whispers returned, not the faint murmurs of before, but deep, guttural voices that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, but their meaning was clear. There was no escape. Suddenly, the black smoke began to coalesce, gathering in the center of the barn, rising up in a swirling vortex of shadow. Alex watched, frozen in place, as the smoke twisted and turned, forming into a figure far larger and more menacing than the one he had faced before. Its shape was vaguely human, but grotesquely elongated, with long, spindly limbs and a face that was nothing but a black void. It towered over him, its presence so overpowering that it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. The barn creaked and groaned around them, as if it were struggling to contain the force that now filled it. The figure's mouth, or what passed for a mouth, opened wide, revealing a swirling abyss of darkness. And then, from deep within that abyss, Alex heard it, a voice, unmistakable and chilling. It was his brother. "Alex, help me." The sound of his brother's voice, so weak and full of despair, hit Alex like a punch to the gut. His heart raced, and for a moment, the fear threatened to overtake him again. But then, something inside him snapped. He had come too far to let this thing take him now. His brother was still in there, trapped in the darkness, and this thing, this monstrosity, was the key to freeing him. The figure lunged at him, its long arms stretching out like shadowy claws, but Alex was ready this time. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp, and scrambled to his feet. The whispers in his head were louder now, more frantic, trying to confuse him, to make him doubt himself. But Alex wasn't listening. He could feel the connection between him and his brother, faint but there, a lifeline that hadn't yet been severed. He wasn't going to abandon him again. As the creature lunged at him again, Alex felt something stir deep inside him, a force he hadn't known he possessed. It wasn't fear or anger. but something stronger: resolve. He had made his choice, back in the darkness of his mind, when the entity had tried to break him. He had chosen to hold on to the love he had for his brother, and now that choice was his strength. The creature, sensing the shift in him, hesitated for a brief second, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. That was all Alex needed. Without thinking, he rushed toward the creature, the shadows whipping around him like cold fingers. The barn shook violently, as if trying to stop him, the walls groaning and creaking, but Alex didn't slow. He reached out, his hand plunging into the swirling mass of darkness where the creature's heart should be, and for a moment, everything went still. The whispers stopped, the barn fell silent, and all he could hear was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, from deep within the creature, he felt it, a pulse, faint but unmistakable. His brother. He was still in there, trapped in whatever hell this thing had created. Alex gritted his teeth and pushed deeper, his arm disappearing into the black void, his fingers searching for something, anything to hold on to. The creature screeched, its form writhing and twisting in agony, but Alex didn't let go. He could feel his brother now so close, and with one final, desperate pull, he yanked him free. The darkness exploded outward, sending Alex flying across the barn. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him, but when he opened his eyes, he saw it. His brother, lying on the ground a few feet away, unconscious but alive. The creature was gone, its shadowy form dissipating into the air like smoke. The barn, too, had changed. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air was gone, the walls no longer groaning under the weight of some unseen force. It was over. Alex crawled to his brother's side, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch him. For a moment, he was afraid that this was another trick, another cruel illusion, but when his brother stirred, blinking up at him with dazed eyes, Alex knew it was real. He had done it. He had faced the darkness, faced his fear, and won. But as they sat there, the barn quiet and still around them, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The whispers were gone, the creature was defeated, but the barn, it still felt wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a lingering sense of dread that told him this wasn't the end. The entity might be gone, but the evil that had birthed it, the force that had taken his brother all those years ago, was still here. It was waiting, watching, and one day it would return. As the stillness of the barn settled around them, Alex cradled his brother in his arms, feeling the warmth of his skin, the slow rise and fall of his chest. It was over, or so it seemed. The dark entity had been banished, the oppressive shadows dispersed, and for the first time in years, Alex felt a glimmer of peace. But something lingered in the back of his mind, an uneasy sensation that twisted in his gut. The air was too quiet, too still. The barn, though no longer alive with malevolent energy, still felt wrong. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting. His brother stirred, groggy and disoriented, his eyes flickering open. Alex. His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but it was real. For the first time in years, Alex could hear his brother's voice, clear and alive. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. There was something in his brother's eyes, something haunted, as though he had seen too much, experienced something far worse than Alex could comprehend. His brother clutched Alex's arm, his grip tight despite his frailty. "It's not over," he murmured, his voice trembling. "It's never over." Alex's blood ran cold at the words. His brother's eyes, wide and terrified, darted around the barn as though searching for something lurking in the shadows. The darkness had receded, but not entirely. There were corners of the barn, deep and untouched by light, where shadows still seemed to writhe and flicker. Alex followed his brother's gaze, his heart pounding as the feeling of dread crept back into his bones. He had thought the entity was gone, destroyed in the final confrontation, but now he wasn't so sure. The barn was too quiet, too expectant. Suddenly, a faint sound reached his ears. At first, it was barely perceptible, like a distant murmur carried on the wind, but it grew steadily louder. A whisper, soft and almost melodic, curling through the air like smoke. It was the same whisper he had heard before, when the barn had first called to him, but now it was different. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the whispering grew louder, filling the barn with an eerie, almost hypnotic cadence. His brother sat up, his face pale and drawn. "Do you hear it?" he asked, his voice shaky. Alex nodded, his heart hammering in his chest. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, seeping out of the very walls, growing louder with each passing second. He turned, scanning the barn, searching for the source, but there was nothing, just shadows and emptiness. But he knew better. The barn wasn't empty. It had never been. Alex's mind raced. The entity might have been defeated, but the barn itself was a prison, a conduit for something far older and more dangerous. The whispers weren't just remnants of the creature. They were a warning. The barn was alive, and whatever force had been controlling the entity was still here, lurking in the foundations, waiting for the right moment to strike again. It had been biding its time, feeding off the fear and pain of everyone who had ever entered. And now, even with the entity gone, it was still hungry. Without warning, the temperature in the barn plummeted. A chill swept through the air, so cold it felt like ice against his skin. Alex's breath came out in clouds, and his brother shivered beside him, his eyes wide with fear. The whispers grew more frantic, more insistent, until they filled every corner of the barn, a deafening cacophony of voices that threatened to overwhelm his senses. The walls began to creak and groan, the floor shifting beneath their feet as if the barn itself was waking up. Panic surged through Alex as the realization hit him. They weren't safe. They had never been safe. The entity had been just a puppet, a small part of the larger evil that still pulsed within the barn's walls. And now that evil was stirring, roused by the conflict, by the fear, and it wasn't going to let them go. Not without a price. His brother grabbed his arm, his voice urgent. "We have to leave, now." Alex didn't need to be told twice. He pulled his brother to his feet, the two of them stumbling toward the exit as the barn seemed to close in around them. The whispers became a roar, filling his ears, drowning out every other sound. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, reaching out toward them, as if the barn itself was trying to pull them back. The floorboards creaked and splintered beneath their feet, and the air grew impossibly cold, freezing their skin as they ran. Just as they reached the door, Alex glanced back, his heart pounding in his chest. In the far corner of the barn, where the shadows were deepest, he saw it. A figure, tall, thin, and impossibly dark, standing just beyond the reach of the light. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Alex could feel its eyes on him, watching, waiting. It wasn't the entity he had fought. It was something worse, something older, something that had been there long before he had ever set foot in the barn. And it wasn't going anywhere. With a final surge of adrenaline, Alex pushed through the door, dragging his brother with him. The cold night air hit them like a slap to the face, but they didn't stop running until they were far from the barn, the whispers still ringing in their ears. They collapsed in the grass, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from the cold and the fear. For a moment, the world was silent again, the barn nothing but a dark silhouette against the horizon. But Alex knew the truth. The evil wasn't gone. It had never been gone. The barn still stood, and whatever lived inside it would continue to wait, to feed, until someone else was foolish enough to enter. As he lay there, staring up at the sky, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not really. The whispers might have faded, but they were still there, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to call out again. And the next time, Alex wasn't sure he would be able to resist.